Hi, Dr. Scott Beyer here, and I'm going to spend some time today going over why really chronic vertigo and anxiety go hand in hand, okay? And if you've seen any of our other videos, you know by now that when it comes to vertigo, ultimately why people get it is that the brain cannot calibrate whatever information gets sent to it. It can't calibrate it or interpret it, so we get dizzy, okay? And if you guys seen any other video, you know that our body is equipped with hundreds of thousands of different sensors or receptors. There are ones in our eyes, there are ones in our muscles, there are ones in our inner ear called our vestibular system. And they are going almost 24/7. So they're constantly feeding the brain with information, because one of the most basic functions, one of the most actually important functions that our brain needs to do is to be able to know what in the heck our body is doing, what our environment is doing in relationship to our body, because if we don't, it's very, very hard for us to ambulate, it's very, very hard for our species to survive, those types of things, okay? So these guys are constantly feeding, constantly sending messages up to the brain, and there's this one area that sits behind our brain. So to kind of orient ourselves, this right here is our cortex, okay? Below that, back and kind of underneath that, sits this area of our brain called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is, you know, we can spend hours and hours on this topic alone, but it tends to integrate certain information, okay? And it's very involved in like the timing, processing of information. And what it does is it takes all of this information, and what it does is it calibrates it. It condenses all of that information down into a nice, easily portrayed message to where it sends up to the cortex, so the cortex can say, this is what our body's actually doing, okay? Well, what happens is that if this system that dampens all of that input fails, what we see is it can no longer dampen all of this input coming in, and the cerebellum starts having excessive output, okay? Now what happens is if we can't dampen that, the cerebellum will fire into other areas, okay? In particular, other areas of our brainstem. So when the cerebellum fires into, you know, certain areas like our pons or our medulla, you can get things that like heart changes or blood pressure changes, heart palpitations, those types of things. If you've ever, you know, were a kid and you went on like one of those crazy spinny teacup rides, okay, first of all, you know, your body has a lot more information coming in, or your brain has a lot more information coming into the brain than just like walking on one of those spinny teacup rides. But if you've ever been on one of those spinny teacup rides and you got nauseous after it, that's because your cerebellum couldn't handle all of that information, and now we've gotten some spillover into the lower areas of our brainstem, which houses a lot of our gut function, and that's in our medulla, and that's when you get nauseous or sometimes even vomiting. But in particular, with those with anxiety, what happens is if we see a failure of the dampening or being able to package that information nicely for the brain, and there's too much firing, our cerebellum can fire into this upper brainstem called our midbrain, and that's kind of more like our reactive portion of our brain. So when this tends to overfire up here, it tends to promote things like sensitivities to bright light, or loud noises, or blood pressure changes, or because it's a more reactive area of our brain, people can tend to startle easier. But what happens is chronically, if this area is overstimulated, what happens is people tend to, it tends to drive thought. So people tend to think too much, or they have this little motor that's going on in their head where when they try and shut it off, they just can't. So they have sleep issues, and they tend to predict the worse. And that's why a lot of times, because vertigo is essentially, you know, a certain weakness in certain vital brain areas that are very closely linked to other vital brain areas that help control behavior or anxiety. So this is a lot of times why we see these two linked, and a lot of times if we're able to take care of some of the vertigo by proper, diet or rehabilitation, we'll start to see some of the anxiety go down as the vertigo goes down. So I hope you guys found this interesting. If you do, I encourage you to check out our page, Integrative Brain and Body, or ibrainandbody.com. We have tons of other videos, tons of other blog posts that are just there for you guys to learn. So that's what we're all about. So I'm Dr. Scott Beyer. You guys have a wonderful day.